Hello everyone, today we talk about Byzantine history from Justinian to Iconoclasm. Yeah, I know it's too, large as a topic, and this is just one of our introductory videos, an overview on these years go fundamentally from the death actually of Justinian, which is not included in the second half of the 6th century, to basically the end of the iconoclasm actually happened in the 40s, officially, the 40s of the 9th century. There were actually two phases. Today we'll try to cover this broader period, which we address already in part, right? We made several videos about Byzantine history, touching here and there the various topics scattered in this timeline. We addressed iconoclasm. We should definitely do again, because one day we will have to make, actually, I don't know, 4 hours long video about iconoclasm, which is actually a topic that the historiography has all to still rewrite in many ways, because it's much more complicated than it seems, and still there's not been a full and serious approach to the matter. I can tell it because I've been working with a person that actually studied this. I had to introduce this work to a conference, and it made me really realize that also, even if I had studied something about Byzantine history at university, actually the story here is way more complicated. So from these videos, naturally we don't want to derive who knows which solid truth and depth and etc. But I think, as always, it's important to give this overall picture, to just know more or less where the thing was coming from and where did it go to, right? And we will see, for example, today with the gradual establishment of the thematic system, and we'll see how this fundamentally is carried. We don't know much about it either, how and when and precisely the thing took form, right? And we generally attribute these reforms to this emperor or the other, but as a matter of fact, the thing is much more complex, and sometimes such phenomena were having much older roots and continuing for centuries fundamentally. And one at that point has to understand rather that the dynamic standing behind it, rather than who and when did the thing, because that it cannot be reduced to that fundamentally as such. And it's obvious, actually, we started this. These videos are purely manualistic, right? If it's just for a broader approach Byzantine history, if you've never even heard anything about it, right? So, but we also started another series that is still mixed in the playlists here, Byzantine history, that starts to dig a bit deeper in the question. So we will actually address all of these topics, as we were saying before, at some point more accurately and more in depth, definitely. So the picture we observe today is the post-Justinian times that we made, I think, something like 4 or 5 videos about. So from that point of view, you have enough background to go check out if you're interested in it, at least. There is this process in which the administrative and military structures of the empire began to know a deep reorganization, right? And we mostly associate this phenomenon to the reigns of the emperors Maurice 582, 602, and Heraclius 610, 641, right? And definitely these are very important emperors, especially the second. That is definitely one of the greatest figures in Byzantine history, and it was thanks to these rulers that the empire actually could overcome those very, very serious, extremely difficult situations that were produced during the decades of their reign, both domestically, think of revolts and religious disputes, and also across the borders, right? Because of the pressure exercised by Slavs, Avars, Persians, Sassanid Persians. We made, by the way, recently a video exactly on these peoples in relation to the Byzantine frontier, so you can find it in the relative playlist. because of the Arabs, because of the Islamic invasions. And actually we made a video about that too, in which we included the Bulgars and also the Slavs. We'll see now the Slavic migration. We talked about it often, and it's something that went along actually for some time, and that exploited actually this more punching and impacting invasions that, as we will see now, took away very big chunks of the empire away. Right, this is valid for the Slavs on the long run. In many ways were absorbed and at least changing, however, a lot about internal dynamics. But the Bulgarians, until the 11th century, actually remained a pretty serious problem, pretty close to Constantinople. The Sassanid also, think about Heraclius, and also the previous struggles on the eastern frontier, of course, but they conquered enormous parts of the Near East. To Constantinople, and especially Islam, right? That instead took away permanently some of the most florid provinces of the empire. It triggered the process that, in many ways, we will be seeing today overall, right? This process that some, we have discussed the meaning of Roman, of Byzantine, etc. But the process, that I call them basically in both ways, depending on which side of the story you want to stress. And when we talk about properly a process of Byzantinization, we will look at chiefly the empire after the Islamic invasions and the pressures also from the Balkanic frontier, because objectively, like the empire underwent a downsizing, territorially speaking. It started relying on certain specific also ethnocultural basis, and this triggered many factors, including if you wanted, the reorganization, but also the Eastern influence in many ways on the empire, therefore catalyzing and accelerating certain trends that could have gone differently, right, hadn't these major events not presented themselves. So persecuting the work of Maurice, that had basically given a new systematization to the western provinces, right, unifying in the hands of the exarchs of Ravenna and of Carthage the military power and the civilian one, right, that since the time of Diocletian were neatly distinguished. Heraclius rewrote fundamentally the territorial districts of the East, calling them teams, in fact, and putting at the head of each strategos that was to command the same district, distributed lands at the benefit of the military, the stratiotes, right, the farmers and ex-slaves, right. So in order to found the premises of a territorial arm, right, not composed by mercenaries, but essentially by peasant soldiers, ideally and strongly motivated for the defense of their own territory, their own homes. Right. This is the general picture. I mean, Maurice, that we have seen many times how Justinian had brought under its control the great part of the Western Mediterranean that had previously belonged to the empire, where Rome stood, of course, and having to cope with the military reorganization of these lands, right? Also because for a very, even under Saint Justinian, there were certain setbacks. Thinking about the Longobards invasion, for example, in Italy, or the Berber pressure in Africa. So that's not surprisingly that we have named Ravenna and Carthage, exactly because this became the seats of the central governments of the provinces, right? Largely of peninsular Italy the first, in fact, and of Roman Africa the second, that were in a way already the premise of the thematic transformation. Many people actually say that the teams were experimented by the same Justinian, right? That Heraclius maybe gave more impulse, reshape, especially thinking in the Anatolian lands that would become, in fact, on the long run, some of the most important centers of the empire. But we don't know exactly when the thing happened. We don't know whether it happened, for example, when Heraclius reconquered Anatolia from the Sassanid Persians that had arrived fundamentally to the Aegean Sea, and therefore exploiting this emergential situation and militarizing the area, or whether the thing happened later when the Arabs came to press on the essentially Anatolian Syrian border and invading actually the same Anatolia at some point. Think about the siege of Constantinople at the beginning of the 8th century. Therefore, bringing the need to properly to territorialize the defenses, therefore finding a political and social premise for this militarization, as we've seen, right? And this went in parallel to a territorialization of the armies, as we've seen, and naturally also of an attempt of Constantinople to increase the control, at least on the strategoi, of the governors / commanders, fundamentals of these lands, but also of fearing these territorial forces that were fundamentally, permanent, at least in sense of potential mobilization, and actually starting relying on in Constantinople for the construction of a more professional army. This is a process that actually started in the 9th to 10th centuries and developed exactly because of the problems that the thematic system had produced in many ways. So the thing is complex. We will address that from a military point of view on another occasion. But this is the general frame that we must understand, is that, there were certain moments of acceleration of the processes, but actually was a very long-term one. We don't know most of what was behind the decisional process of these reforms, right? So we have literally no ideas. Since the time of Diocletian or Constantine, we don't clearly understand who did what, right? If these reforms are attributable literally to the emperor or to his government entourage. There was also a process of, for example, in this shrinking of the empire. We've seen it in certain videos of the the regrowth in importance of the Senate, of the council, right, at the decisional level, the conflicts with the emperor, with the same church, as we will see now. So the process is complex, and the naturally Anatolia represented the major landmass of the empire, right? As the Balkans, in many ways, were the homeland proper. Of course, Constantinople was in Europe, and some of the most important centers of the empire faced the Aegean. But the point is that the system in which the empire had relied on up to this point, which was fundamentally of late antique model, right? It was based on the city, on the coastal maritime communications. The maritime trade also declined, especially after the Islamic invasions with the end of the uncontrasted Roman thalassocracy in the Mediterranean, and therefore the country, let's say properly the continental dimension of the empire, the hinterland, started gaining a weight on its own, right? And in the Balkans, most of the hinterland was Slavicized and difficult to control. Anatolia, that was in many ways also still wild in the hinterland, right? The major centers of the region were still along the coasts, right? In the western part, of course, in the hinterland were also some important cities, etc. But the frontier began to develop in this regard with a proper structuring of the continental communities and their relation to the land. Right, so not just there is naturally a decline, a contraction in monetary activity, right? In the problem of also, the great intercontinental trade was shrinking, so there was an obvious coming back on the land, and this was fundamental for the sake of the major expanses of the empire, were of course military, right? So at this point, the natural transactions, the idea that if you could serve it, because you can't dispose yourself of the land after all without waiting all this bureaucratic system that had developed since late antique times to provide you with the equipment, etc. becomes the new normal. It also triggers, as we've seen, some important changes culturally speaking, because basically the empire finds itself to cope with chunks of these interlands that are very different one from the others, right? There's not much of a shared identity in many ways. I mean, we could make examples, but to think about the geographical extremes of the empire, and how these, are already drawn on a base of which the empire will shrink eventually, right? The loss of Syria, Palestine, and Egypt in the hands of the Arabs is not like, by chance, right? That those same provinces largely opened the gates to the invaders because they had, after all, interest to be under another domination compared to one of Constantinople. And here you can already see fundamentally the union of the southern Balkans and Anatolia as a kind of a already more familiar entity to Constantinople than these areas that had been under Roman control since more than half of a millennium, right? So they theoretically had to be part of the world. Now we're drifting away because of the end of the universal control of the empire over the Mediterranean and Europe, of course. So these are big dynamics that you must take into account also when you address religious problems, right? And we'll see now the various heresies and the same iconoclasm and why these problems emerged in the Byzantine Empire, right? Because Western Europe fundamentally wasn't going like that. The even newly Christianized peoples in the West were actually much more orthodox now than what the same Byzantines were doing, right? And you understand that the reasons were political. That what the Constantinople was doing was acrobacies to keep all these lands together. Well, the whole thing was falling apart just from structural, systemic reasons. And the importance of the defense of the territory is also vital because the empire risked really to be wiped out, right? Especially the siege of Constantinople 17 was a way more important battle than, the Battle of Poitiers in 732 in the West, that had definitely a much a smaller strategical impact. But also the same Battle of Acroinos maybe can be compared to the one of Poitiers, but how frequently we do hear of this battle. Also the major defeats in the 40s, for example, the 7th century at the end of the Arabs, both on land and at sea, right? And also let's reflect on the non-deterministic approach we should have, because all these things may have not happened, right? They of course, if they were happening, something triggered that, but the same Islamic conquest, for example, was absolutely not, to happen forcefully, right? Islam could be stopped if the Muslims had lost just one of those battles that brought them to the conquest of Palestine and Syria. The thing might have been halted simply because the movement was at that point also very unstable within itself and was actually being fueled by these victories, and just one defeat might have brought consistent parts of the still pagan, by the way, Arab tribes to say, okay, this new god doesn't make us win really fully. So and even there we have to understand the reasons of the empire and observe that this system, after all, were working also pretty well, right? Given the context, the scenario there that was this dramatic and that now we'll see, a loss of some of the most important and productive regions of the empire. I mean, Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, even part of Mesopotamia. I mean, at the time were some of the most advanced regions in the world, right? So this was a heavy blow, a major blow. Also because these were now seized by an enemy of the empire that began to fight pretty closely in the Eastern Mediterranean, actually, and on the Anatolian frontier, against the empire itself, arriving literally under the gates of Constantinople. And the plague, right? Just to give the context here briefly, but you already know what I'm talking about. Between 626 and 630, after having regained the cohesion of the empire after civil wars and the Sassanid invasions, Heraclius managed with this very bold military campaign to occupy the capital of Sassanid Persia, right? So, Ctesiphon, right? The Romans did it more than once in their history, and the problem had always been the same one, trying to break at least the Persian state was being formed in Mesopotamia, as the Persians, of course, could return to their Iranian nests, the Iranian plateau, that were unreachable, right? But the Sasanian Empire at this point had become quite of a kind of a state-like thing, right? They had occupying Mesopotamia and expanding even in Arabia, and beyond that, they controlled some of the Caucasus, exerting their influence even on the Horn of Africa. They controlled de facto all the major trade routes with the East, right? The Roman Empire was in constant contact with China at this time because they were the major powers controlling the routes. The Sassanids were, benefiting from the routes. The Sassanids were in the middle, so they were drawing all of the resources with the tolls, etc. So the main problem was striking the unity of the state formed in Mesopotamia. It was the only area where the Persians had actual cities working as with extensive agricultural irrigation system, having the demographic manpower, the wealth, right? So crushing Ctesiphon in Mesopotamia meant to literally destroy the Persian Empire, not destroying the Persians of the plateau, but still managing to exert an enormous influence all over the area. And especially at this time, actually, to have a much longer impact than before, right? The Romans had crushed the Persians on multiple occasions back in the day, but the economy was still functioning in a way that the Parthians and the Sassanid afterwards managed to regain control of certain areas. By the 7th centuries, as you know, the economical demographic contraction brought the loss of these resources to be way more difficult to recover on the long run. So after the defeat of the Sassanid defeat of Nineveh at the hands of the Roman or Heraclius, the situation was pretty serious for Persia, and this is of what the Arabs actually benefited from. Consider at this point, we have talked about it when we discussed on that video on Byzantine auxiliaries, also the famous the Lakhmids, the Ghassanids. These were Arab kingdoms, we could call them at this point, or kind of clusters of tribes, fundamentally headed by an appointed ruler, fighting respectively on behalf of the Sassanids and Romans, right, on the in Mesopotamia, fundamentally between Mesopotamia and the Arabian desert. And therefore Arabia was leaving, especially the areas of the Hijaz where Islam spread from, were already framed within the range of these major civilizations. Also Yemen, southwestern Arabia had known a major civilization that actually began to crumble with the collapse of Marib Dam in Justinian times, so right around, I think, in the second half of the 6th century. So these were worlds where the centers of the major intercontinental routes of Eurasia, they knew civilization, and the rise of Islam naturally has to do with what the Arabs had seen these worlds were about. They knew pretty well, right? Here it's complex. We've made some videos about the emergence of Islam, and especially from this strictly military point of view, which is extremely fascinating, by the way, given the background, right? But we're talking now of certain populations that were aware things were on the move, and they knew how to exploit the gaps that were formed, right? After the defeat of Nineveh, the Persians had been obliged to give to the Byzantines the regions that they had taken away from them like 20 years before, right? The Sassanids had made this massive thrust through Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and part of Mesopotamia, right? The whole Near East was basically lost to the Byzantines at some point. What Heraclius did was amazing, was to revert the tides and to actually crush the Persians. So many people say, this was really the end of the Persian Empire. Rome won. Yeah, but probably the Persians would have resumed their power in a way or another. And actually, even under Islam, what was the massive cultural impact of Persian civilization in all these, the region, in the Middle East, and beyond. But this is once again another aspect. But think about even just the perspective of these regions. I mean, what it really meant to just live in this condition of constant instability and eventually of decline that had to be settled once for all. Right? This would have become the next frontiers of a prolonged struggle between Rome and Islam, and probably the reason why they gave up, aside from the religious instances that were, however, reflecting the political one, was to be as decentralized from Constantinople as they could. And after all, the Arabs were just military tribes that, once they settled in these lands, basically blended with local aristocracy that became part fundamentally, remained in charge in many ways, right? All these aristocracies made a career in the state that already existed. That the Muslims simply came to rule after the Byzantines went away. So there was an enormous continuity between the Islamic rule of these lands and the actually same Roman Empire, because after all, think about all the Hellenistic culture, all the libraries that existed at this point, it weren't at all destroyed by the Muslims. That was a propaganda that themselves they used to say, look, we read just the Quran. That's especially the first conqueror, but we perfectly know from basically every level of philology, of history of literature, etc., that the Muslims came, that they entered in possession and they treasured in an extremely jealous way an enormous quantity, literally, of knowledge of these enormous Hellenistic libraries that were lost to the same Byzantines. Like in medieval Islamic literature, we find information that in Constantinople they didn't have anymore. That was actually, of course, of Hellenic or Hellenistic origin, and that was also some of major scientific, cosmological, geographical, historical notions that you find in the whole Islamic area, even up to the Far East Asia, that were carried there. Think about the epics of Alexander or Aristotelianism, or all what eventually was, re-elaborated by the Muslims and eventually re-arriving in Europe fundamentally via Spain, right? To the west, centuries later. But here, I really care in this video to give the picture of the sheer size of this phenomenon, right? How the world war civilization was fundamentally reshaped by these, right? And we're talking about processes that passed literally through a single battle, like the 636 Battle of the Yarmouk River, that decided in many ways that the fate of Islam, or the continuation of the Roman rule in the Near East, right? And that really marked an era, an epoch, and still to this point. Going back on the religious aspect of the story, Heraclius, after having won on the battlefield, he attempted, but somewhat in vain, to seize the opposition of the Monophysites, right, of Syria and Palestine. This heresy that believes fundamentally just in one nature of Christ, basically with a bias for the divine one. This has connections with many other aspects. We recently made a video on Gnosticism, how these Eastern provinces fundamentally maintained all these philosophical, elaborations that had, as we've seen here, deeper motivations. It's not just about one guy deciding arbitrarily when a metropolitan of Alexandria or Jerusalem or Antioch to, from a day to another, now that he's agreed, right? It was all a political move. It was really a matter of cultural differences, right? We can't conceive, even in the Roman Empire, there's never been an homogeneous entity where everybody was blended in together, as they would like to make us believe today. The empire was a set of multicultural territories that were in fact multiculturally different, each one had their own thing. They of course shared a lot. There was a lot of intersections in this regard, and naturally, even during under Roman domination, many things got confused. Some were lost. Actually, the Roman Empire worked a bit as a great also extinguisher of different creeds and ideas, but overall, there were certain major structural differences that had to do with with a lot of dynamics back in the day in the ancient world, right? It's obvious that, I don't know, Greece had a completely different mindset from areas that had been dominated for millennia by the pharaohs or great kings, right? There is really a different dialectic, even the same Roman emperors used in these various and different lands. And all these tensions reflected fundamentally the autonomistic attempts of these regions, right? And this was mostly intense in Syria and in Palestine, right? Egypt also was very important because Egypt was, as you know, the granary of the empire, especially Africa, yes, mostly for the West, mostly for Italy, but for Constantinople, I mean for Rome, for Constantinople it was really Egypt, right? And in fact, the loss of the region to the Muslims brought also a complete redirection of the trade, the grain imports vectors from actually towards the Black Sea. So even in there, triggering all different political relations with different peoples, and also internal dynamics, right? You can imagine the big shifts even in the capitals invested, of the social classes, of the political figures within the same Byzantine government. That all these crisis. It was a deep crisis. It was a ferocious crisis, right? Here that the plague had really made a mess. The countryside was exhausted. The empire had used literally all of its forces. The obvious reason, of course, why the Muslims were not stopped, was the shrinking of the same Roman military capabilities, right? That, at this point, we're in the deep crisis. Like, the 7th century is objectively in the whole, medieval scenario, like the moment of greatest contraction. Then eventually the rest was all growth in a way or another, right? But the 7th century is a very complicated period also historically, exactly because we don't know much about it in the first place, because these systems got simpler, but as a consequence the individual changes brought to were amplified, because it was now much easier to make the change direction, the system change, take a different turn, and it's underdocumented, and in many ways, however, it's one of the single most important for the history, I would say, of the Byzantine Empire as such, right, of this greater Roman Empire that, however, underwent in this moment of crisis of a great, let's say, enclosing of its own. It was a cultural choice, right, within its own cultures, within its own traditions, of formulas that actually were not much of a continuation of previous times, but were created even originally at this very moment. Of course, with an imposing cultural legacy. Think about the reorganization at this point. Think about the official titles that came back to being Greek, not in Latin as they had been before. Of course, with a major Latin legacy within it, but still something that wanted to proclaim something different, and also to other entities that in the West were, acting in a wholly different manner. Like the Western Europe now was definitely falling under a very different circumstance, where under different ethnic and political the guidance, and the thing was definitely perceived also in there as a founding moment of a lot of what we know later as medieval Western civilization, that in a way we would detach from the one of the Byzantine East, right? Which I don't know how healthy it is, right? But at the time was definitely perceived, and it was a real thing, right? These entities had an enormous lot in common, but it's definitely important to see how much they grew, like they fell apart from one another at this time. And as we will see, also iconoclasm had a major impact on there. But first and foremost, the fracture of the Mediterranean unity that was essentially the one that had connected the Roman Empire is fundamentally a Mediterranean and only secondly a European power, you could say, because literally the most advanced, rich, educated, prosperous area are part of the Mediterranean, right? Of course, also of Europe, but the fracture of this reality brings the West to avoid Europe, the continent, to take over in many ways from both sides, from one side and another, right? As we've seen, the Byzantines now rely much more with the continental relations within the Balkans, in Asia Minor, in the steppes, right, as an horizon, right, where in the southeast there is the enemy. Also, the Western Europeans begin now to detach themselves even from that maritime dimension that had participated. Rome, is part of this broader culture of the Italic hinterland that at one point took over, right, the Mediterranean and started the whole thing. But at this point, there is properly a separation, even in terms of a few tens of miles, right? Some of the most intriguing fact, in Byzantine Italy, that's quite evident. We made a video on it. The Longobards controlling the hinterland. Up to from the north to south of the peninsula, not just in the north, as many people think. The Byzantines control the coasts, and they live in a completely different, more urban and maritime context compared to the rural one of the Longobards, that of course are actually based on the cities, but there's a difference between a city that is, in the center of the Po Valley and one that is open to East Mediterranean. The same actually happens to the Balkans themselves. Like, even in Peloponnese, when step away in the hinterland, there are Slavs. The countryside speaks Slav, and there are Slavs there, right? And this is true for amplifying, the thing when you rise up towards the north, and the peninsula widens in the same exact way, right? So we're talking about actually also very important demographic dynamics, right? There is all in the socio-economical ones, because also great cities need a countryside to work like, and if the countryside is controlled by someone else, well, the thing starts becoming really interesting, right? And you have to take important decisions at that point. So this system is very, very important to get acquainted to, and what Heraclius thinks he can do with Syria and Palestine, that are by far some of the most important regions at that point for the empire, is to calm down the Monophysites by elaborating through the Patriarch of Constantinople, Sergius, a doctrine that, in spite of the conclusions of the former Council of Chalcedonia, prospected that the two natures of Christ were united fundamentally in a single will, right? This is monothelitism, right? This was eventually condemned as an heresy. It was a compromise to say, okay, let's say that in Christ that there is just one nature, there are two, but that these two natures function because of a single will. And the question is, why? Because is Christ schizophrenic for some reason? This, doctrinally speaking, is as stupid as it sounds, but if you don't contextualize it in the political goal of the empire at the time, you can't fully grasp it, right? So this is important because it's definitely a desperate situation, right? The empire that is not just the Roman, but probably the Christian empire that is still the universal one, recognized as such by all, even the other powers surrounding it, is coming to terms with heresies just to maintain some regions. That this is the face of the crisis. And by the way, in the West, everybody is triggered, but it's like, what the heck are you doing? Christologically speaking, and that's when the also this increase of the distrust between, in fact, now we can't call the Byzantines, right? Even if they're the Romans, they were always remained that, but that's how the thing was perceived at the time. The Greeks, as were later called by the Germanic emperors, like the idea that, after all, the garrisons that were in Italy at this point, they were Roman. The one that were in Rome properly, they were Roman, but now with Rome, with Italy, with West, had a few to do after all. These were fundamentally occupants in many ways, and especially this was seen by at a political and social level, but by a lot of people that by that point had refused arms in hand, right, to this very model. I mean, the Longobards invasions, the Slavic invasion, had brought a different view there. The Longobards had founded a kingdom and said, halt, right here we are not part of anything that is remotely what was seen as before. Here there was a different anthropological vision of what the freemen, for example, had fundamentally to be, right? And this entailed all the various socio-economical relations. Think about what had happened during the Gothic War in Justinian times there, right? The rebellion of the slaves, all the fact that they basically the colonists of the late Roman Empire had been transformed into serfs under the control of a very few landowners. So the process here is being reversed by these invasions that had a terrific success. It weren't at all something disruptive, like the most disruptive thing it happened ever were the same Roman reconquests that destroyed some of the most productive lands of the empire, and that from their perspective they hadn't also much of an option either in that regard. But it's obvious that the fractures, the differences, the different interests, goals, and objectives and models were beginning to be felt, right? And the thing would be widened over time. And in fact, as we were saying before, the major event, absolutely, also in global history, the Islamic invasions, right? That this is what really changes the whole thing. When Heraclius was still alive, by the way, interestingly enough, the Muslims had in their historiography since at that time had actually a very positive idea of Heraclius himself. They somewhat acknowledged what the empire really was, after all, and their military offensive, however, deprived the empire of this huge part of the eastern territories. A few decades later, the African ones would have made the same end. Africa was fundamentally poorly garrisoned. It wasn't like they didn't have properly an interland with a peasantry that could work for military bulk like Africa had basically never had it. The African frontier had always been easier to understand, but in fact it was also much thinner. So for anybody with a base in a civilized country like Egypt or Palestine or Syria might have wiped them out. This is what the Muslims basically do. The point is that the Muslims occupy Persia. They take over also a huge part of the Middle East, and they're theoretically at the beginning all one thing that is fighting against the empire. So it's really a very complicated picture, also because the Islamic conquests, contrarily to what was commonly believed, maybe to inflate their power from the Western perspectives, that didn't bring to a unity of the Middle East at all, right? The Middle East, in spite of all the wars, also the Near East, that had been waged since ancient times, it had, after all, always fallen under one major empire, at least two major empires clashing against one another. The Islamic conquests brought to this, immediate namely conquest of the whole thing, but eventually they fragmented dramatically. And not before, however, having tried this major push against the empire for basically 1 century. It's like the Muslim invasions stop, in 80 years. The major ones at least, they stop to the Atlantic, to the Indus, to the West and the East respectively. And at that point, right, for many other empires alike, when there is not much to conquer anymore, the problem is to control what you have seized. And given the Arabs have probably not a land base of power on their own, because they literally came out of the desert and they simply rode over everything they met. At a certain point, they had to come to rule on the base of the pre-existing chunks of power that were already there. So historically speaking, the great river valleys of the Nile, the Tigris, and the Euphrates, and other centers like think about Africa that is somewhat fertile to roughly today's Tunisia, compared to the surroundings in North Africa, and Spain later on. So dynamics now that we can't see, but we discuss and we'll keep discussing on another occasion. And so you have to think it from the Roman perspective here. The Islamic invasion was a major tragedy because it brought, it nullified, it simply wiped out all the success that up to that point the empire, especially Heraclius, that in his lifetime made an incredible work. Maybe with an excessive, even here historiographically, the judgment could vary a little bit, because analyzing those campaigns actually is much more controversial than you. I mean, the one of reconquest against the Persians, also especially what happened before the previous civil war, is they're very interesting, and actually we will discuss them at some point, because Heraclius passes for the greatest guy ever, right? But at the same time, I think he made a couple of mistakes that were actually pretty serious and in part triggered the whole situation at some point. But aside from this, that we won't be discussing, the sheer collapse. I mean, think about the sheer scale of the collapse here, brought to the necessity of literally of reshaping now all the military and civil systems, right? And we must give that the empire actually did pretty well at this point. Like on the long run, especially on the long run perspective, the administrative, institutional reforms were actually working on the long run. They bore good fruits in the end. But as we were saying before, there is this major wave, like in 674 and in 687, the Arabs reached the same Constantinople, right, to threaten it, and the territories of the empire were reduced now to comprehend just a consistent part of Anatolia that was now, however, ravaged by the Arab incursions, eastern Thrace, right, and the Italian dominations that the empire had managed to retain after the Lombard offense. And in this dramatic context, it was thanks to the dynasty known as the Isaurian one, albeit they were actually of Syrian origin, that rose on the throne with Leo III between 717 and 741, and destined to remain on it up to 820. The Arab advance was halted, right? And there were terrific victories obtained by Leo III himself, that was the one who saved the besieged capital in 717, 718, and that eventually crushed the enemies at the Battle of Acroinos, that were remaining before, in 740. So the empire actually loses the control in the sea, because all the arsenals of Syria, Palestine, and Egypt that had some, think about Lebanon, some military, actually, naval engineering traditions were seized by the Muslims, that actually fought against Constantinople with Christian crews. Like we hear the religion has a very relative meaning, right? Because we have seen that these communities were in part forced naturally, but from the other side, that were, however, fine to keep Constantinople out of their business. So we're talking literally here about there is also piracy that develops, right? And this piracy is saying, these are the Saracens, but actually, if you look at them, you can't even distinguish whether these were Christian, Byzantines, or were Islamic Saracens, because guess what? Pirates are there just to make a freaking lot of money. They don't give a damn what kind of religion you are. And the thing complicates, as we've seen also from the Islamic side, there is a fragmentation. So there are lots of Muslims that are allied with Constantinople, and there is also many Christian communities of the Near East, Caucasus, Middle East that inside with Muslims, and the same Muslims have their own deep religious problems, right? Think about just the Sunni and the Shia, right? Just telling one, but it doesn't end there, right? There are lots of other branches that form at this point and create lots of problems, and that have repercussions even on the same empire, because aside from the major cultural influences, but just from a military point of view, the heretics of the Islamic world are confined by the orthodoxy on, for example, the Anatolian frontier. There is all a cultural tradition there that will always revive and be even embraced by some Christian communities. So it's actually very complex, and that's why I don't like so much this all-encompassing videos. But they at least give me the opportunity to give you food for thought. But I presume you actually already know these things in outline, and at least, and so actually the control on the sea now is compromised, right? And this is a big problem because this is no good even for the just for trade, right? Obviously the empire keeps trading with Islam, right, on the long run, and there is really no other way that the thing could be done. The point is, though, that the instability brought by the political fracture and the Persia and eventually the various invasions, at some point Crete will be lost. I mean, the thing gets really dangerous, even just because the Muslims come to raid very, very deep into Byzantine waters, let's say. So the thing obviously triggers the difficulty in the maritime context, and this in turn triggers the separations of the lands of the empire that up to that point had been united via sea. This happens in large scale because if your navy now is to be employed not just to roam around and suppress the various rebellions, but just to be constantly committed to another maritime foe, like all those who you kept down through deterrence, in that way, in your own empire will start moving away, right, drifting apart. And this is really what will make lose the empire outer land and actually concentrate mostly on this, you can say, Balkanic Anatolian dimension. However, the Isaurian emperors worked significantly at an administrative level, exactly for this reason, substituting the prefectures of the praetorium that disappeared with the 4 logothesias, the ministries, and posing actually the strategoi, that, as we have seen before, were at the head of the themes, to the direct dependencies of the emperor. And this basically erased what had been the institutional system of the late Roman Empire, right? And that had divided fundamentally the military and the civilian functions, just to basically militarize the empire, to control it with this namely very well defined and direct hierarchy based mostly focusing mostly on the actual control of the territory in the interland. And this also triggers that what we call before as the process of Byzantinization, if you want, or Hellenization of the state, right? Because naturally now the empire had shrunk on certain bases that were mainly Hellenic, right? At least from a cultural point of view, the dominating element was the one of Hellenic or Hellenistic legacy. So all this, for example, Chamitic, say, or Semitic elements were left out, but with Islamic invasions. There was definitely also the injection of new ethnicities from the Balkans, as we've seen. So the thing actually transitioned. There wasn't, even with the Slavic invasions, wasn't like of a cultural competition. Like, these people were Hellenized in the long run because the state educated in that sense, right? It began since Justinian times. So compared to the West, a more meritocratic career in the public offices that were drawn for the middle classes, and that had to pass through an actual summa of Hellenic literature that had to be learned, right? This was still somewhat a low form of education, and nothing to do with one of, say, the great senators, for example, that existed still in places like Gaul, in Italy, that were the ones who really were actually the true elite from a cultural point of view. But this formula, this synthesis, had now become part properly of the statal structures of the empire, that albeit now shrinking, we're still bearing now the essence of this mostly local, but the Aegean speaks Greek in that regard. So that is what is taught in Constantinople, and that comes to dominate on this wider areas. The same goes for Anatolia. Anatolia had a quite composite ethnic background, but even in there, the hinterland wasn't like culturally competitive with the capital and the major cities in this regard. It had always gravitated around the Hellenistic orbit. Anyway, so here we locate all these changes at the cultural level that, as we've remembered before, had to do with the recognition of Greek, like the official language in place of Latin. That, by the way, was not spoken in the eastern regions, nor in the Balkans at this point, right? Especially with the Slavization of the Balkans, Latin, went lost in greater part, aside maybe from areas like Wallachia, right, or etc. But the major part that they spoke either Slav or Greek, right? Or something like Turkic, like Bulgar, or some relics of the Traco-Illyrian languages. So the thing was, even in there, very, very articulated. But at the same time, the pattern is now more homogeneous. It's stratified in a more homogeneous way, it seems. To the Latin titles of Imperator, Caesar, and Augustus was substituted the one of Basileus. Even this actually changed. There was a competition, for example, when the Bulgarian came, they started appointing their, when they converted, to Christianity, the Tsar was recognized the title of Basileus, as such, and the Byzantines began to add one of autocrator. I mean, there was a bit of a variation, but Basileus, with the small changes, would remain fundamentally as the base of the imperial denomination up to the end of the empire. The empresses maintained actually the Latin Augusta as a title, former title, but generally speaking, there was really a shrinking, probably on a narrower cultural base of Hellenic matrix, we can say. That doesn't mean that other cultures or other ethnicities didn't participate in this, but as we were saying before, once again, they were brought fundamentally in the dominating culture that was a highly, of course, literate and civilized one. So most of these the neighbors hadn't developed anything like that. Maybe the main cultures there were Latin, like in terms of written civilization, Latin, Greek, and from the other side now it was Persian and Arab that also was rising now too, however with important contributions from the same Greek through that process we mentioned before about the libraries, etc. And as you can imagine, also from a socio-economical point of view, things began to change, right? There was a strengthening of the small land owners, right? This was actually a positive process. We can say it's also what allowed, in part, the empire to remain on its feet, right? It probably gave it at the beginning less aggressivity overall, because after all, the great landowners, think about the Bucellari back in the day, these private armies raised by the landowners, etc., where the latifundium still worked, could field important forces that were somewhat cohesed under the guidance of the magnate. But in terms of political stability, the crisis of the larger estates brought fundamentally to a stabilization, at least of the internal political balance, right? There was less competition within the empire that, as we've seen, had between the end of the 6th, beginning of the 7th century, actually lots of problems, even from that point of view. There were entire provinces, the same Heracles had risen from Africa, like, there had been, or I don't remember what it was actually, but, the idea is that still there could be a major instability that could engulf the whole empire. At this point, the thing starts narrowing down to either the Constantinople or, however, to much more controllable phenomena that didn't bring to major splits of the empire, at least on that base. And naturally this corresponded to a weakening of the whole system from an economical point of view, right? At least it was a reflection of it, right? The idea that in terms of crop rates, we're talking about a dramatic fall. Like also just about labor force, entire regions when depopulated were transformed into frontiers. There wasn't much to work in there anymore. So the landscape in many ways also changed. And the Byzantine Empire in this regard undergoes much more similar dynamics than the West in some ways, right? The reason this happens actually in the same Islamic part, all the Mediterranean in many ways is facing the same dynamics in a way. There's much more similarities than we often want to see. The same fall in intercontinental trade, in the maritime, traffics, etc., had made all these major land-owning systems falling apart, right, and remodeling on more local basis. It was simply a reason of investment, right? So it was naturally beneficial. It was coming from a serious cause, from a disruptive cause, but it was, the right move, right? There weren't many other options, and the bulk of this small landowners, after all, would be very important for the recovery of the empire on the long run. It would be defended actually by several emperors up to the beginning of the 11th century, right? And this was something that the West didn't have the same way, right? The same reasons why the Byzantine Empire didn't feudalize on the long run, but fundamentally emanated something halfway between feudalism and this more equal distribution of wealth, like the paranoia system, for example, or that it's like the Itka in Islam, right? So it's a Western of things will take a very different turn, but we're also kind of far. It will happen 300 years later for now, especially in the founding moment. And there was another phenomenon in all of these that was the increasing importance of the monasteries. Why? Well, because the monasteries had fundamentally been born in an environment was effectively the rural one, the one that had always been opposed ecclesiologically a bit to the secular clergy, to the great metropolitic seats, hence the greatest cities, right? During the crisis of late antiquity, the monastery had become a point of reference for the faithful, the peasantry. The donations to these institutions increased, right? And the monasteries, as a consequence, grew ever more powerful, right? And the point is also that these foundations often enjoyed tax exemptions, right? So these entities, like especially in the Byzantine world, in the Latin Germanic West, it's not the same thing. In the Byzantine world, these monasteries, especially in the peripheral areas of the empire, the ones more far away from Constantinople, became huge landowners. They were actually landlords of enormous size that had an enormous power all over the provinces where they stood, and that began to increase the process of political fragmentation of the empire, right? There was a friction, right, a contrast of socio-economical character within the church that is directly connected. In fact, at the beginning of the 8th century, it's all connected right here with the world events that happened. With the development, starting from Asia Minor, of that iconoclastic movement that was characterized for the aversion to the cult of the images of God, of the Virgin, and of the saints wherever they were reproduced. This is very important Why Asia Minor? So oceans of inks have been written about this. Asia Minor has been seen in many ways as the cradle of many movements. We've looked at, for example, we're talking about Martian. It was 300 years before this. Actually, no more. Actually, 500 years. But still in a context that is very similar. It was the same Asia Minor. Right, this is where Gnostic ideas were of both Neoplatonic and Hellenistic rational influence had developed the contempt towards the material, the physical dimension of the world. That had probably harbored similar, tendencies of the monophasitic ones in the Near East, but being closer had not escaped to Constantinople, as we've seen, as provinces. These were areas that were also more directly exposed to Islam, right? And that together with Judaism, that was also accused at that point of having influenced the iconoclasts, which is probably true in some way, but naturally Islam at that point was the major influencer, with all the legions that were developed at this proposal. That had brought, naturally because of the Mosaic guide, the question of the non-representation of God, and this was naturally conflicting with the principle of incarnation, and the fact that, of course, the images of God had to be were for Christians were to be venerated, right? Not falling into idolatry, which was another thing, and that in many ways in this greater monastery was also becoming something similar to that. So iconoclasm is very multifaceted. You see, also these monasteries were often based, of course, on a local saint, on this great picture images that were considered to be thaumaturgic, miraculous, and that the local peasant population were largely pagan and still believed, in fact, in this, superstitions, etc., began to attach this kind of more idolatric than actually venerating symbolism to. The monasteries played on this, of course, and they increased, in this sense also, the diversification of the allegiance, right? If you believe, if the saint becomes your patron and not the emperor, not the empire, you're basically losing also faith in the world civil political commitment. You're becoming more fatalist. You are prone to give more authority to the local monastic institution rather than to the broader imperial direction. Naturally, there are many tensions because, as we have seen, these monasteries emerge mostly in other areas like the Balkans or in southern Italy, areas that were somewhat more detached from Constantinople, even the same Balkans, because just a few kilometers, a few tens of kilometers out of Constantinople, it was a wholly different world. The Slavs had come up to there; they couldn't control even Western Thrace properly at that point. I mean, the Byzantines. So there is a great. The monasteries are filthy rich, so naturally at this point the empire wants to cash fast. These guys enjoy exemptions, as we have seen. So there's all an inner, an interrelated set of causes that all goes towards the direction of what eventually was defined as iconoclasm, but probably at the beginning was something very different, right? The major problem with iconoclasm is that we know mostly about what, basically a reinvention, what this thing, whatever it actually really was, which we don't know. We don't know, right? What we know is what was reinvented afterwards, from people that were just discrediting, the past, the Isaurians, and those who had essentially backed the religious policy, as if these guys had literally, fought to destroy everything that they had viciously, abandoned the idea that the incarnation could be represented, right? This thing actually is not proven at all, and actually the same iconoclastic condemnation was based on texts that had been written by the same iconoclasts back in the day. I mean, the best sources that we have from the so-called iconoclast written by the iconoclasts are to be found in the anti-iconoclastic propaganda, because these were people who, after all, were themselves probably largely against the destruction of the icons, as we know. But in later times, for reasons of restabilization of the empire, for reestablishing a firm rule, and sticking around a solid orthodox core that couldn't leave for any other room for other ambiguity, had reinvented the fact that these guys had all been a bunch of just destroyed. The thing was very, very, very different, as much as we can understand. The tensions are all true, and that there were. Consider in this sense that Isaurians were properly influenced by Christological heresies, Islamic and Jewish influences that had vehiculated the hostility towards the representation of the divine in human forms, and therefore this had especially brought the Isaurians to back those areas of Anatolia where they were more sensitive to this iconoclastic arguments, right? So probably what happened was very different from what was done with monothelitism that we've seen before, it's not a chance also that it was an emperor of Eastern origin, Leo III, that made its own the reasons of the iconoclasts and to impose by decree the destruction of the icons, right? In 726, this is what actually brought Saint Pope Gregory III to excommunicate him in 731. And the clash, consider that the iconoclast was not even the term used up to the modern age, right? The word, here it's complicated, that's why we should make a video about this. But let's say the clash was between the iconoclasts and the iconodules, roughly speaking, that practiced the iconodules, those that practice actually the cult of the icons, and that considered as sacrilegious their distraction. And the successor of Leo III, his son Constantine V, 741-755, persecuted, right, with a firm hand, the paternal policy, and this took on more political and social characters, like it had already happened in the past because of the religious disputes. And this reflects definitely the opposition of the Western and the Eastern provinces, right, where the numerous people didn't really look very favorably the power, especially the economical power, the high clergy, and had more ambitions of autonomy from central power. The clash went on. There was especially a clash with the papacy, right, that owned huge land and monasteries in southern Italy, Calabria, and Sicily, and that that point still functioned like that those lands were in the hands of the Romans, and they hadn't been overrun by the Arabs. Later on, the papacy will undergo this phenomenon for which it will grow more like a properly Italic thing because of the Arabs conquered Sicily and they lost all this southern. But the iconoclasts confiscated an enormous amount of wealth in those regions, and this triggered now a bitter resentment even within the papacy, and the tones were so harsh we can't even understand properly what the whole thing was. But just for saying that iconoclasm, it doesn't seem to have been a particularly linear process, or that we can't really read through it. Most of the history we read of it has been written much later, when the thing was over, when whatever way the thing had gone, who had been the promoter of by how much large scale this thing had happened, was rewritten, right? It was written to re-inject legitimacy in the new establishment. So it's a very biased perspective, right? This is not to say that iconoclasm did not exist, but it was probably something very different from what we think it practically was, right? And there were different phases. In the years of the Emperor Constantine VI, 780-797, his mother Irene, that had ended up to blind her own son in order to rule alone, had in Nicaea the Seventh Ecumenic Council, 787, that firmly pronounced against iconoclasm, right? Irene was definitely from an iconodual background, but she eventually, played poorly. At least it was a great backlash against her because of her political and military, actions. She was seen in here also as she did this thing of she went against iconoclasm, but she didn't much good for the rest. So the thing would reemerge and stop finally only by 1843, where Michael III, 842-867, calling the decisions of the Council 787, in fact, of Nicaea, reintroduced the cult of the images and the relics, realizing with the provision of this not small importance also for the destinies of the Christian figurative art. Think about the impact of icons, Byzantine world, in Eastern Europe, right, in the Orthodox Church in general, a new religious cohesion. So that it's probably from there that the icon comes back to be firmly like a cultural identifier of Constantinople and of Orthodoxy, generally speaking, also against other cultures and but also internally to the same empire. And this is important aside from, as we've seen, this strictly cultural point of view, because objectively, like the Mosaic law, right, forbids to represent God, and while the incarnation of Christ had, states otherwise. So there is a conflict here that hadn't been settled doctrinally speaking, at least an apparent. Like there were all this interpretation how that there had been the transition, of course, with the all the various theological points of how the incarnation of Christ had surpassed Mosaic law, how the thing had eventually gone. So I'm skipping the thing dramatically, as you understand, because it's a more fascinating thing than it seems. And once again, iconoclasm was probably not this extremistic thing that it was depicted later. But definitely behind that, there is a great contrast between different models of power, between different degrees of acceptability, even from the local communities, where it was the ones of the western provinces, the more far away, where monasteries had greater impact on the population, where many populations were also or in countryside, where populations were more like pagan-like and still, believing more in the local icon or relic than in other values. And also in think about the relations here between the Caliphate and Constantinople. The idea that the Roman Empire now had to take up this firm position, even in front of the communities living along the frontier. That is, you represent God, you do not represent God. How do you do that? How do you justify it? How do you make them accept it? These are all the factors we have to look at. We have to look at the contrast between the secular ecclesiastical elites and the monastic ones. We have to look at the probably internal struggles between the emperor and the church in some way. So it's complicated. It's not a topic, once again, and finally at this point to treat in a single video like this. Just be aware of the complication of the whole thing. Alright, I think we can stop it here in terms of how some of the major changes that the empire underwent in these 6th, 7th, 8th centuries, and the reasons, the outcomes, and probably looking at a Byzantine culture that defined itself in these very centuries. Before this, the time of Justinian, the empire had definitely already gotten certain kind of more Eastern Hellenistic fashion compared to what the previous centuries Roman Empire had been. But the the idea was still, being open all over the empire, the Mediterranean, and stating this superiority of the empire, the centrality of orthodoxy that had, in a way, prevented all these various minor, these various cultures to take over, right? To have a say that could be that the empire could be compromising with. With the shrinking of the empire, this thing obviously happens because there is not anymore the deterrent force to achieve that. There is not the enough resources to say, okay, now let's simply crush them. So the empire has to come to terms in this way. It has to really change its paradigms, and it has to do it in conditions of enormous difficulty, of great instability on the frontiers especially, and therefore assessing, sometimes with brutality and sometimes with unorthodox decisions, its own authority to make things work. And this naturally doesn't go without consequences, both for worse and for better. Because for worse, of course, certain communities of the empire began to say, okay, well, we don't trust you anymore. We see you with something different. In the West, there is definitely a detachment, like the western territories of the empire, chiefly in Italy. Africa is lost to the Muslims, but Italy begins slowly to emancipate itself, to go towards a completely different direction, in spite of the Byzantine presence, especially in the south. Here we didn't talk about the world expansion of the Longobards at the end of the Exarchate. This is not important, but the empire, however, manages to center itself on a more defined, a more compact base, probably on a landmass, where the cultural element is dominatingly Hellenic. The military element has a lot to do with Anatolian itself, and this is reflected also politically, over maybe in part by same iconoclasm, as a form of, okay, let's appease those guys. Chiefly, they're so important. But at the same time, there is a compactness that remains enucleated here, and that, aside from the swings, manages to stabilize and actually to survive. Literally, this avalanche of peoples that come to besiege the city, Persians, Avars, Slavs, Arabs, other peoples, they will keep coming like crazy, and this thing has the capability to stand its ground and survive. This is astonishing, but it starts from here, right? This thing could be wiped out. The Byzantine Empire could easily end in 717, right? It didn't happen, and it didn't happen because there was a winning formula that made it not, forcibly make it, but that definitely contributed, and that is a product of an extremely peculiar situation in history that we see, after all, rarely, right? Given especially the contexts of a previously probably universal empire, not just by claim but by actual magnitude of power, that has to shrink fundamentally at the regional scale, or encompassing, let's say, a particular amount of regions, and that the military and civil reforms of which will, however, manage this thing to remain strong and to re-expand in the following centuries, in the so-called Golden Age, in the 9th and the 10th century, right? And all emerging from this dark time, because we don't realize what happened. Right, it's obscure because we can't read through it. We have difficulties with sources. We don't exactly know what happened. So it was a kind of Freudian defining, movement in which we can see the desperation probably, and the idea, of course, of not giving up but not accepting that this thing is to be over. Right, and that was stubbornly effective at some point, but also gave probably to the empire certain characters that remained for a long run, in that were not entirely functional to further developments, but this is a wholly different issue now that doesn't even have much sense at this point. We're still remaining here. This is probably one very important thing. This thing remained a state, right? In a time in which, look at what Latin Germanic Europe is going like. Constantinople remains a state. Constantinople, the Roman Empire, remains a centralized institution after all. It doesn't matter where there is the dispersion, the provincialization, the thematic system. That's still probably a city that controls a big amount of territory, and with certain specific institutions, with an administrative net of control that is decentralized, but it operates within the specific boundaries of the empire. You don't find something else in Europe, right? You find it just in the Islamic world that had in fact inherited some of the of the statal legacy of the same Roman Empire, and there would be too much to tell here, because really the Byzantine Empire is a hybrid of also a lot of other elements we often underestimate, like the Balkanic element, like probably the hinterland that, as we've seen here, emerges defeated on the long run, right? There is not much of a capacity of it to take over once again, that they will attempt to do it at some point, but Constantinople will manage to consolidate its power and to control of these territories. And this is also another important process, but we can't talk about it now. So I think we stop it here for now. Forgive my precipitous way of explaining this all, but once again, either I do this or I don't. There's only one way probably of doing it, and we have already addressed these things many times, but trying to define them better each time, or at least taking observing one aspect rather than another, or perspective rather than another on the same topic, and gradually also descending a bit more in the details of this whole thing. But anyhow, for now we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.